just shortly after the Great Depression began, on May 6, 1935, FDR, well, tried to make good on his promise to say he's going to put the people back to work. So he would pass Executive Order 7034 entitled Emergency Relief Appropriation Act of 1935, unilaterally declaring or creating, I should say, the Works Progress Administration. The Works Progress Administration is, well, it's an interesting topic. Why? Because when most people think of the WPA, they think of a institution that put the laborers, the construction workers, the industrial workers, anybody that works with their hands, they put them back to work by creating this nonsense projects like planting trees at Vicksburg that we now can't unplant, so the battlefield's all kind of messed up and you can't get to certain points. Some was, creating roads, which I guess were okay. However, there's another aspect to the WPA that is often not thought of or not cared about at all, but yet is such a rich history. The aspect of the WPA, the Work Progress Administration, that I am talking about is what we call the Federal Writers Project. Now, the Federal Writers Project wasn't something that FDR would initially support. Of course, FDR wasn't too bright on his own, so he needed a select group of Harvard elite to guide him on his policy. We call them the New Dealers. We call them Puritans, Yankees. I don't care what we call them. All I know is that they were people who controlled the intellectual sector of the country. And by intellectual, we can loosely use that word because guess what? They weren't that smart. They just had the means and the power. But anyway, so with the help of First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt and his advisor Harry L. Hopkins, the Work Progress Administration would extend its nationalizing hand over the academic sector of the country. Now, this is obviously with ulterior motive to do this, so that's a disclaimer there. However, they created what we call the Federal Writers Project, which was meant to employ unemployed writers, teachers, professors, journalists, anybody who held that title, whether or not they had a job in that sector before the Great Depression took off, but they were then employed. Okay, the Federal Writers Project was founded by that group, and it was led by these Harvard elite, Columbia Law School, right, and affectionately what we can say the Skull and Bones, because they were part of the Yale group as well. But this person who headed this project was Henry G. Ellsberg. Henry G. Ellsberg was a New Dealer. He was a homosexual. He was a Zionist, and he claimed not to be a socialist, but oddly enough, after this was all said and done, he taught classes on, well, socialism. So, surprise, surprise, during that process, he'd be tried by the House Un-American Committee, right? He'd be tried by them because everybody knew what he was, and he was a Zionist that was, part of that group that should have been tried and unfortunately got out of that one for various reasons that we'll talk about, okay? The writers, though, themselves, they were considered by the House Un-American Committee to be a hotbed of communism, right? Harvard, Yale, Columbia, hotbed of communism. Well, let's just say that's kind of a given at this point. They were accused of being wholly unqualified professionally. Why? Because they never held a job, right? A lot of them didn't hold jobs in that. A lot of them really weren't good writers. They didn't have any justification or credentials to be in that. And the ones who did have those credentials, well, probably weren't the best anyway. They held little or no academic value to anyone. Except for the group that employed them. Okay, nearly 79% of them had not written anything at all. Nothing. They had not been this group that was writing anything. And in this same process, most of them were tried by the House Un-American Committee for being, communists and socialists. Okay, but we can say this, that not all of them were of that mindset. Not all of them had that ideology, right? This is kind of the Nathaniel Hawthorne and Edgar Allan Poe situation with the Hudson River Valley Transcendentalists. We had this group of authors like John Steinbeck who came out of this, and he created what we call the Grapes of Wrath, which is arguably one of the greatest books to ever have been written, mocking these people, mocking the Yankee culture that was, trying to manipulate the culture of the South. Okay, that's the entire point. It's the same thing that Solomon Kane and Conan were about. Okay, so but while that was happening, simultaneously, the Texas Folklore Society, which is the main point of our conversation today, at the University of Texas at Austin, had been operating since 1919 to collect folklore stories from Texas history and, within the peripheries of Texas, the southern stories. It was headed by John Lomax and Leonidas Payne. Okay. The Great Depression, however, had taken a toll on them. And by that, meaning that they were having trouble getting money. They had $11,000 in their bank at that point, which is not a lot, or 11. Yeah. They were lacking in membership. People were leaving in droves because, again, folklore is not really something people are generally interested in, at least then. Now it's a little more interesting and a little more, out there than it was. Okay. And so 2 months after the WPA began, they opened up an office in San Antonio. They extended the invite, said, you know what, Texas Folklore Society, why don't you go ahead and join our payrolls? Let us pay for you. And so, well, they joined forces with the Federal Writers Project. Now, this was something that most people saw as good, and the reason why, because it was an all-expense paid-for vacation for people like John Lomax, who got to go to Haiti and other places in the West Indies. The writers got to travel around the South. Some of them, at times when they were building their road maps, got to go up north. So they got paid to go all over the country and within, the West Indies there, on the taxpayer dollar, which was struggling at that point to be made. But by September 8th, 1937, Henry G. Alsberg and the San Antonio office decided that they wanted to specifically get the stories of the former slaves of the old Confederacy. And just as we know here, that they were getting those stories specifically to try to support the idea that the South was bad, that anybody that stood for a constitutional republic was bad, anybody that wanted freedom and small government was bad, anybody that thought states' rights, they wanted them to be seen as bad. They wanted the white man to be seen as bad because, well, let's face it, Goyim, they don't like us. Okay, so this entire point for these narratives was to get to that point. And they tried hard. Okay, the slave narratives, they were to push the stories from the former slaves, which is known obviously as the slave narratives. And if you get a book, it's the WPA slave narratives between I think it was 36 and 37 was the first wave. And then, and it came in two waves. One, it happened and then it got kind of paused and then it showed up again. And the criteria for those writers were to interview the former slaves, to get all the personal information that they possibly could from these former slaves, to recover all the oral traditions and the families of the former slaves, to modify Gola. And what I mean by modify is to dumb them down, so to speak, to appeal to readers and historians and Northerners who fed on to that stupid Uncle Tom's Cabin and other abolitionist narratives that they pass along there, right? Now, the structure of Gola that they were using, it followed in the fashion of Tom Nelson Page, Julia Peterkins, and our favorite, Joel Chandler Harris, who wrote the infamous Tales of Uncle Remus, which is now canceled, by Disney. And it comes with a disclaimer if you do manage to find it about how racist the movie is. Okay, they were also told to collect surrounding data, which meant legal court cases having to do with slaves, escaped slave stories, advertisement for slave sales, inheritance of slaves, the slave opinion of Union and Confederate officials and generals, plantation owner names and family, names of overseers and other positions that could be beneficial to what was happening historically at the time, and photographs. That was a big deal. They were also told in this process, which is funny, is to be unbiased. to show as much of the truth as possible. Okay. But one could see from that criteria that that wasn't going to happen. And they really were going to try and achieve their narrative. They're socialists, they're communists, they're Zionists, they're Harvard elite. It's that they want what they want out of these, and they were trying to get that. And well, in a second we will see that that didn't work out that way. Okay. Um, the ending of the slave narratives, okay, the average person could not see the usefulness of folklore, especially at that time and being funded by the tax-paying dollars. And so it was kind of like, do we keep the project? Do we not keep the project? Or had the public finally figured out what they were trying to do, right? More importantly, it was bad for the Harvard and Jewish elite, specifically when that kind of Jewish projection narrative started to show up, and you started to have the battle of the old right versus these big money financiers of New England, because again they were trying to vilify the South. They were trying to project a story on the South that was largely untrue, and again they were locked in a conflict with the old right. Okay. Regardless, they had to pivot from the stories because they did not sway in the favor of this narrative. They did not sway in the favor of the projection, the white man bad, those kind of things. And so they had to figure out where to go with. Why did they not sway? It's because less than roughly 10%, I'd say maybe between 5 and 10, 10 at the most, could say anything bad about the South, their plantation owner, or the overseer, who in some cases was a former slave himself. The primary beaters on the plantations were free black or slaves themselves. They were the drivers. So those stories instantly created a very problematic situation for the narrative. Okay, less than 1% had even heard of the word rape or anything else surrounding that. Okay, the majority of them disliked the freedom culture the majority of those former slaves, many of the former slaves, okay, they disliked the culture, the freedom culture that was growing up amongst their own kids, the culture that was brought on and given to them by the various projects through Reconstruction, the social programs. Because let's be honest, a lot of them refused to work, refused to take responsibility, refused to do anything for themselves. So a great deal of former slaves, the children ended up, dying from just not wanting to work and feed themselves. Um, and so, and to top it off, right, is that the bond between the slave and planter grew stronger as Reconstruction began to make things worse and they were actively trying to make things worse through that process. But again, that bond grew stronger rather than worse. Okay, so was it Stockholm syndrome? Nah, that's stupid. That's garbage. That's things that is a cop out for people that don't want to face the truth. It's unprovable. You can't diagnose it, especially in people who lived 165 now years prior to this, and it doesn't qualify as a psychological disorder according to the American Psychology Association. And as it turns out, right, maybe we need to face the facts that, well, bad guys aren't bad guys, and those good guys that we think are good guys aren't actually good guys. Maybe the script is flipped. Okay. Stockholm's is a case where politics was trying to create history, and it was doing a rather poor job at it. So when we look at the Folklore Society and we look at the Federal Writers Project, the supporters took it and supported other things because it was not producing the results that they wanted to be produced. Okay, so the first step is they produced things like the Southern Conference, which was kind of the pre-story to what became the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which we all know held a big role in the civil rights era, which, as we can tell again from the Rosa Parks famous sit-in, that Southern Christian Leadership Conference, well, they would try their absolute hardest to again remove business opportunities from black business owners. Rosa Parks was that. Her sitting at the front of the bus prevented a black business owner from owning a bus stop or a bus line that was going out of business, and he took that opportunity to buy it and revive it and bring it back. After the sit-in with Rosa Parks, that bus line was forever shut down. Okay. And it created the infamous Martin Luther King. It took him from the drug and sex addicted Martin Luther King that was the reality of the situation, and turned him into the Martin Luther King of the hero of the story, the guy that should be praised, or they want him to be praised, right? Not should be praised. Sorry, that they want to be praised. That's what that created. Okay. Now, to ask the question to James the Elder, who is here in the studio again. Okay. And for those of you just tuning in, guys, welcome back to the Sinting Goyim Show. Okay. We are brought to you by the Sinting Goyim Media Group. We are your grassroots intellectual freedom movement that you want and have been waiting for. Okay. James the Elder, I have to ask you, the Texas Folklore Society, right, did more than just the slave narratives, right? So where do we begin with the Texas Folklorists, and where were they most prevalent in this story?
Well, it starts off with, like I said, John Lomax, who was the son of a British immigrant who became involved, was pursued an education as an adult. He's going to uh, the Austin campus. He had an opportunity to go to, I believe, Harvard in a couple of summers, in which point he was mentored by the two Harvard literary professors, which is where he gets the tie into the Yankee elite society. They were his mentors, and they guided him from that point forth. So he
Now, if we
produced.
pause, if we
What's that?
pause real quick, right? That connection to Harvard, right? Is that the primary reason why we're able to talk about the Texas Folklore Society, especially in their role with, like, even the slave narratives, which was a prominent role? Um, they led the project, right? Is that everybody answered to John Lomax? John Lomax then answered to Henry G. Ellsberg.
That's where
Um,
the tie-in came from. Yeah,
okay,
they
okay.
wouldn't have known who he was otherwise,
He was
probably.
tied to that Harvard elite group.
Yeah.
Okay.
Let me get their two names here in just a moment. Oh, I'll come back to that in a minute.
No, you got time.
Anyway,
Got
that's where the connection came from, and um, again, probably wouldn't have been known other than that. You recall when we went through some of the Texas Folklore Society files at University of Texas in Austin. This was a hard-strapped organization relying on small contributions, just small time in any way it can be small time. And Alan Lomax had three children, which became big in the left-wing politics and the folk music, ethno music movement. And the most notable one that we'll probably talk most about tonight is Alan Lomax. So how to get to you get from there, up into the NAACP and up to Martin Luther King is through the Southern blues. He would travel around the South and record these blues artists who were moving in mass up in Chicago at that time from the Mississippi Valley. That's where Muddy Waters came from, and Howlin' Wolf, and a whole bunch of other. That's where Chicago was populated by people from Mississippi, black migrants from the South.
Yeah, who followed Martin Luther King there, and it turned out that they weren't expecting what they got, right?
Well, they weren't. Yeah, in that later time period. Yeah, Martin Luther King didn't know what he was walking into, but this was in the not late 1920s, 1930s. Well, Cadillac Records is an interesting movie on this. It's a little bit romanticized, but you can give somebody an idea of how this recording industry formed at that time with the ethno music and the role of John and Alan Lomax.
Yeah, I gotta say though, looking through those archives, it was really interesting, kind of to see all the tie-ins, right? Especially the elite group and what was, kind of in this sphere of John Lomax, who we really went just to figure out what role he played, and it turned out to be a lot bigger than most people would think, right?
It was huge. It was he was probably the hub of the wheel.
Yeah, and especially because, like, his tie to Henry, Ellsberg, who Ellsberg was an emissary for the American Zionist organization, who, for the Treaty of Paris, right? He was there. He was the emissary for the group, and it's kind of baffling to, why that group was there in the first place, right? But it's like he was tied to that guy, tied to these New Dealers and Harvard elites. Um, yeah, right. So the blues. Let's talk about the blues because that's the most interesting to me, and how the kind of blues and Southern culture go hand in hand, right? Because that's kind of
Sort
where
of,
it.
sort of.
Okay, sort of. So let's enlighten me then. Let's go.
So the word country music didn't exist then, but you could call a lot of these artists black country performers, or it was a hobby. It was a hobby, but they were quite good. And Alan Lomax in like 1935, 36, he would travel through the South with a early recording device and record these people. Muddy Waters, his real name was Morgenstein, I believe. Uh, the unusual name for a sharecropper, but anyway, he was the first really big icon. The people were leaving the South in droves at that time, both white and black and Hispanic, going different places. But the massive migration from the Black Mississippi was to Chicago, and that's where the blues really became potted. And Muddy Waters, long before Dylan went from an acoustic to an electric guitar, he went from an acoustic to an electric guitar for his recording. But he had a very paternalistic relationship with a couple of Jewish promoters in the Macamba Club. Let me get their names for you. The Chess Brothers, and that's what the movie Cadillac Records kind of focuses on. Howlin' Wolf never liked that. He criticized this paternalistic sort of relationship, and the content of the blues was, edgy. A lot of it was pretty sexual. Muddy Waters, in particular, had a large number of paternity suits. He had these Chess Brothers who founded the record company eventually that produced most of the early blues records. Set him up with the best lawyers around to protect against these paternity suits, but he always won, but it took up a good deal of his royalties from the records.
Now, when we talk about the edginess of the sexuality kind of and the vice of those lyrics, right? And then that's obviously to portray messages to the listener too, right? Because a lot of people, when you have that melody and activates those parts of the brain that music does, right? But that, from your notes, that's not the only thing that was that was a part of those lyrics, right? They did use those to communicate things with. What type of things were they trying to
Uh,
communicate
yeah,
besides that?
well, this was all kind of part of the political left at the time, which was the shaping of the Black Jewish Alliance, and uh, there was the Puritan or New England aspect to it too. So it's a very good question, a good point. The political left, this kind of fringe left, consisted of an American component, which was associated with Northern evangelical Protestantism, basically Puritanism out in New England. So when you have, say, the two other real prominent people are Charles Seeger and Pete Seeger. Most people know Pete Seeger as a very prominent folk artist. He described his upbringing as being a idyllic New England Puritan upbringing. Okay, but that was one side of the far left political structure, and the other was created by the massive amount of Jewish immigrants coming primarily from the Pale of Settlement between 1890 and 1924, and they settled New York was the center of gravity, and they also settled in some other East Coast
Now, were
cities, Philadelphia and Chicago.
those were
Um,
Ashkenazi?
they were Ashkenazi. There were other Ashkenazi Jews that were prominent from the 48 era, like Kuhn and Loeb and others that were established. But he had this dialectic within the left of the Puritan culture and the Jewish culture. And music was used, especially by the, I'll call them Jewish Bolsheviks, to try to get new recruits to the movement. And they focused on labor unions. They focused on a lot of white Southerners too, textile workers, miners, and so on. But folk music was the method to reach people. There were other things, stupid stuff like flagpole sitting and dance marathons and things like that, things to normalize the belief system in the culture, which was successful to a significant degree. But they also had a lot of internal strife, which left them with a lot of people who were sympathetic, but not a lot of hardcore members. Maybe 60,000 hardcore Bolshevik communists, and you might have had 10 or 20 times that were somewhat sympathetic with them. But folk music was the main path to get their message in a gentler way to the broader American population.
No, it seems okay. So it seems that if we go down that route, right, a lot of these folklorists, especially that time, right, is that they were actively working within the South, right?
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
They were
That's where they
actively
got
working
their
within the
content,
South,
really.
and that was kind of ground zero for a cultural revolution for a lot of people, because it was like they were into an area that was destroyed and would be destroyed all the way up until 2011, with Virginia being the first state to be in the top 10 GDP. But it seems like they were trying to utilize the emotional aspect. Maybe why would they? Was there something more to folk other than the gentleness of it? Was it a cultural thing? Where did they go, and why was that primarily the type of music versus like blues or
It was cultural and economic. So you had one form of ethnic music was the blues and jazz. Although there were a lot of Jewish jazz performers. That Jewish jazz is a genre in itself, and it was associated with Tin Can Alley in New York. But then the other path of it was the folk music, and the Jewish center of gravity to the American Communist Party resisted that for a long time. But they would go into the upper South and try to organize miners and textile workers in particular. And you'd think that the South would be a good place to farm recruits to this sort of thinking, because they were desperately poor. It was a poor, depressed, downtrodden area, and they did get some followers, but that created kind of a tension between the Black Jewish alliance on one hand, and then how do you appeal to all these poor Southerners on the other? And then the Leo Frank trial also, complicated that situation.
Yeah, especially when the primary point of social conflict for the proceeding prior to the war was even between the poor Southerner and the black folk, the poor, the black folk there. That was the main kind of area of conflict, or the most stress, that not even the planters could figure out how to appease.
Right. Yeah.
Right. And the planters couldn't figure out to do it. This disorganized, folklore leftist, obviously group couldn't figure out, because they never had that same pull.
No, they didn't.
Amongst that group.
Yeah, up through the 20s and early 30s, the folk music was frequently written and sang in Yiddish. And the main group, the most well-known group, were the Freedom Singers Club. That almost sounds contradictory if you think about it. But in their travels into the Upper South, sometimes they would bring back musicians with them. And a lady, I believe her name was Mother Jones, she came back to New York, but the kind of Jewish intellectual establishment didn't like her forming music. I got a quote here from Seeger. Uh, he says, writing under the pseudonym of Carl Sands, the special task of the Workers' Music League is the development of music as a weapon of class struggle. Because of the lack of technical sophistication, the composers collective never felt like American folk music could be revolutionary music. And this eventually led Seeger to conclude, because I couldn't approve of the music I liked, and I couldn't like the music I approved, and I couldn't make either of them connect in any way with the social situation I found. He just basically didn't know what to do. So, but he did take this Mother Jones, who is from Kentucky, Tennessee area, and got her together with his son, Charles Seeger, or excuse me, Pete Seeger, who was really almost on a par with Willy Guthrie in the folk music. Eventually, by Willy Guthrie,
the group that found Bob Dylan, right?
Eventually, yeah. Bob Dylan's family were Jews from Odessa that lived in New York, or excuse me, lived in North Dakota and Minnesota. Actually, not very far from where my father and grandfather came from.
Now, sidetrack real quick, and we'll come back to this because the Willy Guthrie, right, and the Pete Seeger. And in the movie with Bob Dylan, which again, right, I thought it was good, but not knowing enough about the history of that, and this is new to me. The story of Bob Dylan was he traveled to this hospital where Pete was at. And I don't know if someone was on their deathbed in a way, and he like showed up and said, "Oh, let me play you a song." And it was kind of this like from rags to riches, this poor boy of New York, made his way there, and then all of a sudden turned into the superstar, right? Is that, I know that's not how the story went. Obviously, that's how it was told. At what point, like, did the two there thing, especially, boy, I don't know. It's Pete Seeger. He was there, right?
Yeah.
Right. Or that, and Guthrie he was the one almost dead.
Guthrie died of ALS, I believe.
Yeah. Okay. So Guthrie was on his death or in the hospital. And then Pete was there talking to him. And then Bob Dylan showed up and was, then it's like started playing a song.
Yeah.
Right. At what point did like Pete go, I could use this guy for my, movement, and Pete stayed with him the whole time. So now it gives a new aspect that Bob Dylan had a handler, right?
He sort of did, but Pete Seeger is actually, I'd say, somebody that is in some ways a sympathetic character. I don't see him as being, and a lot of people disagree with me on this. I don't see him as being entirely bad. He was a leftist in a time when that was more acceptable. He did. I'll say this: so the Jewish Bolsheviks, that was very atheistic. As you get into the era of Pete Seeger, it started to Christianize communism to a large extent. So communism or Marxism in various forms would have had a much greater appeal, except in America, except for the atheist part of it. But if you understand where it came from, that was kind of part of the deal. But with Seeger and Guthrie, it was certainly something that could be aligned comfortably, at least with the mainstream or more liberal Protestant denominations, and maybe even Catholics. I'm not sure. That might be a little bit of a push, but when you started to see the beginnings of the radical new left neoliberalism, Seeger was really kind of shocked by that.
So so that's an interesting point. Now that makes sense, right? In his story, him and Bob Dylan had they were clashing on how this music was portrayed, right? Pete almost like kept him and tried to keep this out. This story tried to keep him in check by saying, no, don't do this, right? It's this and this and this, right? And Bob Dylan's constantly, no, this is how I want to do it, right? And it was kind of, I guess now it makes sense that you could see that the movie portrayed the way that Pete was kind of keeping that image, so to speak,
He was trying to keep some level of ideological purity. But then that kind of slipped away.
Yeah, keep going.
Oh, go ahead.
No, keep going.
You need to cut it for a minute. You have somebody behind you. So,
all right, go ahead.
One of the quotes that I've heard attributed to Dylan is that he wanted to be bigger than Elvis and thought he could be. So there's a personal ego part of this, and for Seeger, it was more of a mission, a calling. He did not approve of the unplugging that went on with Dylan when he went from and Dylan lost a lot of the folk music crowd when he went from an acoustic to an electric guitar. That was a big deal.
Yeah, it didn't work with his voice either. People can hate me for that, but I'm gonna say it.
Yeah. Yeah, I kind of agree with you. The other thing I'll point out about the group in the 30s and 40s that kind of tied all the American folk music together were the Weavers.
The what?
They did some good songs.
They were the what? The Seegers?
The Weavers.
The Weavers. Oh yeah.
Okay, then the Weavers and Seeger and others came under question by the anti-American McCarthy era committees. And the Weavers went away, but the Kingston Trio, Hang Down Your Head, Tom Dooley, and a bunch of other songs, a lot of which people wouldn't know, and they're kind of American songs, was really kind of a reforming of the Weavers in the 1950s.
Now, what were they trying? This is always a funny point, right? Is sometimes the House Un-American Committee tried people for legitimate things, right? And other times they're like, you look at it and it was they were reaching for the sky, right? So with the Writers Project, a lot of them were tried for being a communist, but tried for being a communist through the idea of plagiarizing like a map book or whatever was written, like the fun facts on the page, right? It was like that was the only thing they could get them for. They couldn't really get them for anything else other than they labeled them in the trial, right, as communists. The same thing like how they tried to get Ayn Rand, which was silly.
Yeah, it was, yeah.
But it's like, so what exactly were, say, like the Weavers in this group tried for? And it probably wasn't what I would hope it would be, right? But what was it?
They were tried for associations that could be linked to the American Communist Party, which that wasn't an unusual thing. You could probably get virtually anyone who is Jewish and anybody with a left-wing political orientation during the Roosevelt years. Harry Hopkins, for sure. Maybe Eleanor Roosevelt. You could do the same thing with all of them.
Yeah, the first.
But I'll say these people were not. They were not atheists. They were not out to destroy Christianity. They were not. They were not Bolsheviks. What were they? They were not capitalist either. Yeah, it was an interesting time. The other thing that was going on then too is when Truman first started to ask for money for Greece, he was told, you'll have to scare the hell out of the American people to get them to go for this. Well, he did. And then that got to be, this is a pretty good political thing. We just need to keep scaring people. And we have this adversary over here, Russia, will make them as big as possible. And it worked.
Yeah, okay, so we talk about that, and one thing that that the Russians really, noticed coming in as as there started to be like a cross-cultural, kind of push in there with a non-kinetic war, right?
Yeah.
Is that American folk music, was making its way over there, and that was seen as something that was absolutely devastating to a culture, specifically their culture, right?
Yeah, it would be. Yeah, yeah, it would be.
Okay. Um, Now we talk about, right, is that they've the I'd say the neoliberal, and that group right there, and how it was, we talked about on this show, it was the, you had the intellectual right versus the intellectual left, in this case the
Yeah.
neoliberals, right? Now the intellectual classes didn't often stand on high regard with like the music of the time, right? And I could be wrong with
No, they
saying
didn't
that
like it. They
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 didn't
were
like
kind
it,
of
right? So
snobbish in that regard.
when it came to this movement, they both had the same goal in mind, right?
Yeah.
How did they find? Was there ever a middle ground, or did this kind of dissension between the folklore or folk music groups, the newer music, kind of pop culture of that time, um, and the intellectual class, right? Was there ever the dissension caused the movement not to work as well as they wanted it to?
It caused it to work differently. So the original music of the revolution was complex. It had, from a technical perspective, like a composer would say, "Oh, this is actually pretty good." The keys, the stories, and the fact that it was in other languages and had to be translated, the bulk of it being in Yiddish, did not translate very well to an American audience. It just wasn't working. So the fact that this new type of folk music uh, was people liked it to a degree, and people bought it, and that redirected things on their own, on its own. It wasn't so much like the Comintern got together and said, "Hey, it's a great idea." They didn't. It just kind of went that way.
Right. Yeah, Yiddish seems like a kind of a red flag for anybody, right? Especially when you have this Ashkenazi Jewish group moving in. Um, and about that time, you had, I think what Hugo Black came into the Supreme Court just about that time, right? Who was, with that group in the first place. But um, it seemed like something America would reject right off the bat,
Well,
and
they
should
would
have.
have. That's why it had to be recreated. And one of the first things that had to be removed from it was the uh, hatred of Christianity. The atheism part had to be either removed or hidden. Now, I don't. Religious adherence during that time wasn't as high as it was later, but people were still culturally Christian for the most part, and especially in the South and in Appalachia, atheism wasn't something that was going to sell real well, and there was no Catholic or Orthodox Church to fight against either. So the whole context just didn't transfer very well.
Now another point of interest here too, right? Especially that it didn't translate, the Yiddish didn't translate, right? The atheistic aspects of that, especially the which is the foundation of the Ashkenazi Jews, which are not, anything biblical, Judaistic, or whatever. It is Kabbalistic, and they kind of create their own path there, right? But when that music was happening, and simultaneously you had Southern, folk music, which was, there's the old South stories coming to life through song, right?
Yeah,
Where was that competition, or did they figure out how to, um I guess, integrate with that?
I think it just integrated with it. You didn't have people liked a lot of the music, and I don't think it was a real deep political analysis. The the mood that I can see from the 30s in particular is kind of similar to what it is today, where there's just a general cynicism towards politics and government in general, and anybody doesn't have a degree of cynicism after seeing everything in the last 20 years needs to maybe take another look at what they think they're perceiving.
Right, right. um Now we started out with the Texas Folklorists, right? Where did this was this kind of a folklore society, or was that in general across this area, or we might have touched on this, but I just want to
Yeah.
come back to it. Right? Is that, or was this specific to John Lomax, the Texas, UT Folklore Society? So it was it, Hook 'em Horn specific, or was it moving across other places?
It crossed Southern society, but it was probably more organized in Texas, Louisiana, Arkansas, Mississippi.
Why were those areas more organized, right? And I know you had John Lomax. John Lomax did a
He was
lot,
the
right?
driver. He was the man.
He was a driver. Okay.
Yeah. And he was the link into elite intellectual culture. How do you make this stuff known? Like, say, if your podcast, if you had one or two people that had big followings already that would say this podcast is good, then suddenly you go from being obscure to being well known, and that's kind of what happened with him.
Okay. So he was like the Charles E. Smith Jr.
Yeah.
Of the podcast.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Okay, so John Lomax was the man. Now, were there other people involved with that, right? And how did we get from Lomax? Did Lomax have any interaction with Seeger or any of them in this process? Was there any?
The son did. The son did.
Okay, so you kind of you said that, just making sure the son.
Yeah. Did Charles Seeger know John Lomax? I think quite possibly. At least he would have known about John Lomax. Now, when you get to Pete Seeger, Alan Lomax, Willy Guthrie, yeah, they all knew each other, and I would say they were all, pretty accomplished musicians too.
Now, okay, yeah, right. Now, were they? I know we had the Southern, the Christian Leadership Conference, right? So was this just another kind of wing of things that the National Folklore whatever organization was trying to support? Was that, or they just started like figuring out where, like you talked about civil rights in your notes, right? Was this just an area of like civil rights that they could go? It's like, oh, we'll put this here, and then we'll have folk music there. And just kind of create that cultural revolution from multiple aspects.
They were going at it from multiple paths, but there were multiple paths that were destined to bump into each other.
Okay.
The NAACP was an entirely Jewish organization. They had a few black people in New York. Everything was run out of New York. But even the black members of the organization were more white than they were black. And New York had a different culture. Most of the black population in New York at that time came from the Caribbean island. They weren't Southern at all.
Right. Never. Yeah. And that's the big conundrum with a lot of the things that people, the left talk about when it comes to the South and slavery and things like that. Now this Ashkenazi group, right? I want to ask this question, but I don't want to reach too far on this. When it came to like what they funded, and they had the NAACP, that area again, the Christian Leadership Conference. What, other than the fact that you had the record company, right? Was there anybody else that were prominent but funding other areas of music not specific to folk? I guess I think I stretched on that one. Let me re-ask that. Did they fund other categories or genres of music other than folk? Right. I know we could talk about the Seegers and them, which is great, but from other places, because if we look at like E. Michael Jones' book Dionysus, right, Rising, it seemed that they went from folk and those other civil rights movement to newer music as if they were still failing and had to reinvent themselves.
Yeah, I would say that's probably true. You started to have quite a few record companies, and most of the record companies did come from people of that background. But was there any organization to it? I can't really say.
Okay.
I don't know.
I think we hit everything. What else? What else can you add to
that? That covers it pretty well. If I was going to recommend anything to anybody, is the music's interesting. Listen to some of it. It kind of beyond what words can do. It kind of puts you in a place and time and gives a perspective on things. But by knowing the backstory, it's easier to place and easier to understand.
Yeah, it's to that end, right? It's funny because it seems like, those stories and the backstory and how the music's written, right? It's a you have this just one long genealogy of this group organizing themselves, right, from the early 1900s to how whatever mid 19th century, mid 1900s, sorry, not 19th century,
Yeah,
1900s, right? You have this just genealogy of, let's try this and we'll reinvent ourselves this as
we're in ourselves with this.
whatever
Then
we
we'll get
could
mad
do.
at each other and split and form two factions, and yeah,
Right. Let's it was in a way you see a lot of this political nonsense, right? And they never know how to organize. And it seems like this moment from the Federal Writers Project, even the start of the Folklore Society, right? Utilize the Federal Writers Project, then move on to the kind of or catapulted the Folklore Society forward with the folk music and everything. It was the moment in time where I would argue that they were the most organized as far as political narrative went, right?
yeah, they were the most organized, but they were also uh, kind of like coaching a football game or a soccer game. They were continually reacting to things around them and changing, and little steps can make for big changes over a period of time. But well, I'll say that there was a most of the people that guided these movements were smart enough. They were strategic, only one step at a time. They never saw what the second or third step is. And also, if you look at American foreign policy, which you're seeing today, that was strategic, one point at a time, too. So you can wind up with some very strange endpoints when you take it over several decades.
Yeah, and again, though, you look at the Ashkenazi group, and you look at that entire lifespan of them. It seems like they've always, with exception of very few who run like the top of that group, right? They've always been reactionary, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Everything they do is one step this, oh, we need to move this, one step that, and then they do that until the upper group steps in and says, no, we're going to think two steps for you,
yeah.
and then
Mm,
we'll release you again. Except for now, obviously they're hands on the entire time.
yes. Mm.
All right. Well, we appreciate you tuning in again. We appreciate the support on the last video. We will come back to what's going on because, as I predicted right off the bat from that last episode, is Donald Trump had a peace talk and Israel went and messed it up. So we'll see how that pans out after today. I know we got a couple days where they're talking that over. So hopefully by next episode we will be able to inform you on what happened. But make no mistakes that this information you heard today is directly connected to a lot of these Jewish groups that have been operating in the United States for longer than you think. I know this phenomenon might seem as a new thing. Oh, they just showed up. This Israel group just appeared and started doing this, and so on and so forth. But they haven't. They have had a long global genealogy that spans not just the world, but America specifically, from our colonies to now. They have had a great deal of influence and control and power on how things work. And for a brief moment in time, they couldn't keep their hands on America, but that was all lost again. So when we look at these cultural revolutions, these Ashkenazi groups that were, going with the folklore, the folk music, understand that that's just one aspect that they have been operating in. That's not the only one. That's not a new thing, but it is good to see this genealogy come together and the various spots that it showed up in, because it helps us understand what's happening now and helps us kind of direct and see what may happen in the future and predict things. Because that's what history is for, is to help orient ourselves in the present and, look to the future with a relatively certain um, idea as to what's going to happen. So we appreciate you. Thanks for tuning into the Dissenting Goyim Show, episode 15. Again, brought to you by the Dissenting Goyim Media Group, your intellectual grassroots freedom movement that you have been waiting for and wanting. We are your new favorite show. We appreciate that. You will find us on Rumble. You'll find us on Spotify. You will find us on clips on X. We'll put the link to the show in X. We'll have the clips on YouTube and link to the show on YouTube. But please go comment, like, subscribe, follow, tell your mom, tell your friends, just tell anyone you can. Shout it from the rooftops, I guess. Until next time, we will see you later.